weekend, James Gunn closed out his Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, so today I'm going to stop and rank all 5 MCU trilogies from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of the MCU trilogies. My list is not the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours as we go into this. I didn't include the Avengers or Thor because there are 4 movies, thus making them quadrilogies, not trilogies, and let's get started. Coming in last place, the AntMan Trilogy. To be perfectly clear, I find the AntMan movies very pleasant. In particular, the first 2 are simple, small-scale adventures that are a nice break from all of these MCU films trying to up the ante, trying to just go bigger and bigger. And then in the middle of it all, you have these stories that one is a simple heist story, the other is a simple MacGuffin story that are more personal. They're about a family. That's their charm. That's what they use as their advantage. They're about simple, fun antics. That's what I like about them. And I think they lost that a little bit with Quantumania, or not a little bit, they lost that entirely with Quantumania, where they tried to tell this big, gigantic story with massive world building and introducing the big bad villain, but they wanted to keep the simple, lighthearted tone, in which case they had to play it entirely safe. They couldn't actually go for it with the movie, so it had some fun moments. It had some, like, jokes that worked for me. There's some action sequences that are large in scale, but it just felt like generic MCU stuff. And when we really needed to establish Kang as a big villain, instead of using Kang as a mechanism to maybe close out the AntMan trilogy by locking Scott Lang in the quantum realm or doing something like that, they just played it entirely safe and gave us a happy ending. Oops! But it wasn't even a resolution to this trilogy of films or any plot arcs or anything like that was going on. It just felt very anticlimactic considering how much they built this movie up as the kickoff to Phase 5, our true introduction to Kang. In the trailers, they had Scott Lang saying, "I don't need to win, we both need to lose." And then Scott wins. They win. There was no consequences of it that were meaningful. And so you have a trilogy of films where none of them are like top tier. All the other trilogies on this list have at least one top tier film. You just have a couple movies, a few movies that get on base. And it doesn't feel like it's a complete story for Scott Lang. It doesn't feel like there's continued themes by the time you get to the end of it. You just got a 3 mid-tier, lower mid-tier, maybe a little bit of bottom tier with Quantumania. That's what this kind of feels like to me. So not very fulfilling as a trilogy. And while there's some fun to be had, they're never fantastic. Number 4, the Iron Man Trilogy. And this is an interesting one because I would say it has one of the best MCU films, one of the worst MCU films, and one of the more underrated MCU films while still being a very flawed film. And this being the first MCU trilogy also has a lot of MCU growing pains inside of it. I adore the original Iron Man. It's a fantastic kickoff to the MCU. It did such a great job of establishing the world, the characters, that you felt like you could build the rest of the franchise on top of it. They figured out the code or the formula for how you tell a story that is about a character. It's character-based, but also has big action and it's funny. They just nailed that tone in a way that a number of comic book movies, in particular Marvel movies of the zeros, weren't able to quite figure out that code yet. They figured it out, and it's led to this incredibly prolific franchise, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Then, a couple years later, we get Iron Man 2, a movie where I think the cast is still charming. The action sequences, when they happen, are still really good, but the story, the script are really messy. And the way that it's structured, you don't have a lot of tension in it because Tony doesn't know that the villain is out there until you get to the third act of the film, or when the villain just shows up in front of him. Tony's not actively trying to track down Whiplash in the movie. So it lacks tension. And it's a movie that one of the biggest criticisms that it feels like a Avengers setup film. That's a very legitimate criticism of the film. There's the characters kind of squished in there, plot points that feel like they were mandated because we needed to get to the Avengers. Well documented that Jon Favreau wanted 3 years to write, shoot, edit the film, and he was only given 2 years, and you feel that when you watch the movie. And so a movie that was the MCU figuring out how do you build out a universe, how do you do sequels? They were learning a lot with it. And then you get to Iron Man 3, where they didn't know if Robert Downey Jr. was going to come back. So they close out Tony Stark's arc in that film. It feels like the conclusion to his journey, but obviously it wasn't. He's stuck with the MCU for 6 more years, and they gave us an even better conclusion to his journey and gave us many more paths to take his character on throughout all of his other appearances in the MCU, in which case it almost negates the point of Iron Man 3. Now, I think Iron Man 3 has a lot more to offer than a lot of people give it credit for. Of course, the Mandarin twist is very silly, but once you get past that, I think the character moments, the dialogue, the fact that it's back to Tony Stark on his own, a bunch of really great things about the movie. But when you view it as a trilogy inside of the MCU, the quality wildly uneven. And because this didn't end up being the end of his arc, I mean, they undid the end of Iron Man 3 2 years later in Age of Ultron. I mean, they just did not stick to it at all. Doesn't feel like a complete story, but like a misdirect of an end in case they couldn't sign a contract. But they did sign the contract, so not a great trilogy of films. In third, the SpiderMan Trilogy, and at this point in time on the list, things start getting really tricky for me because all 3 of these franchises, I have such wildly different feelings and emotions about them and experiences, and different reasons why each of them does something really special above the other 2. And different things about each of them to why maybe they'd be a little bit lower on the list. Now, when it comes to the Spider-Man movies, 2 of these movies are in my top 10 MCU films. And then one of them, Far From Home, I had in my bottom tier in my tier ranking from last weekend. And in certain ways, my feelings on Far From Home kind of capture my frustration with this trilogy. And that's to say that I feel like it's a superficially fun experience. It's lighthearted. You're off with Spider-Man, a character that's just very enjoyable to be around. Jake Gyllenhaal is chewing up the scenery, but the story, the foundation for it, just makes absolutely no sense. And there's a bunch of little things kind of inside of it where it just felt like they didn't stop to think about their story. They just knew the energy they wanted to have and ran with it. And that's kind of the way that I feel about this trilogy. There's so many fantastic elements to it, whether villains that I love, No Way Home being just such a phenomenal experience for Spider-Man fans. But on the actual story mechanics, there's so many odd, bizarre choices all throughout this entire thing. Like on a grand scale level, they would rather take Spider-Man to Washington, D.C., Europe, or play around in the multiverse than have Spider-Man just do normal Spider-Man things in New York City. Like they're avoiding every iconic Spider-Man thing because they don't want to rehash what was done in the previous franchises. Fair enough. I get why you did something different in Homecoming. But by the time you've done a whole trilogy and it's not until the end of the 3rd movie where you're doing normal stuff, that's a little bit weird. Likewise, I've repeatedly said kind of my issues with No Way Home, where it's a fantastic experience because of what they delivered with the setup. The setup itself, it just feels lazy. I get why Peter Parker is motivated to go to a wizard to change everyone's brains with magic. I do not understand why a very smart adult wizard would break into a spell without pausing to discuss parameters. It just doesn't make any sense, and it only happens so that the movie can happen. And it's frustrating because I like the idea that we're getting a very high school Peter Parker. I like the way that they ended up throughout the trilogy, subverting our expectations, where we kept waiting to hear about their version of Uncle Ben, and they changed it and did it with Aunt May in No Way Home. So you get the iconic, important things in Peter Parker's life that teach him that message: with great power comes great responsibility. But they did it at a very different point in time than we were expecting. Did something fresh and new while being true to the source material. I loved that. Of course, I loved getting our previous Spider-Man coming in here. But on a story level, I don't think it was ever as strong. Superficially, wildly entertaining. Some fantastic fan service. Some great, clever ideas in there. Stories themselves, not crazy. Our runner-up, the Captain America Trilogy. Now, to be perfectly clear, if all I was doing for this ranking was averaging my ratings for each of these movies, Captain America would be in the top spot. If all I was doing was averaging my placement in my MCU ranking, once again, Captain America's in the top spot. I think the quality of the movies as individual entities is most consistent with the Captain America franchise. When it comes to First Avenger, I think that it is a very cool experience where you're doing a superhero origin story during World War II. I love the aesthetic of it. The score's fantastic. I love the nobility of Steve Rogers and his old-fashioned classic sense of heroism. Love it. Of course, Winter Soldier, one of the most praised MCU films for being like a political thriller inside this franchise. While it brings in some more mature themes, it still manages to have the fun and the humor, but it also has some of the more visceral action set pieces. So for a lot of you, this is your number one MCU film. It's not quite that high for me, but I still think it's a great movie. And then you get to Civil War, and a movie I've been praising ever since it came out, because I feel like it finds a way to do this very interesting earned conflict where you can see why each side of our Avengers would fall where they fall on this issue of the Sokovia Accords, based off of their worldview, based off their past experiences and what led them to this meeting. And you can still, as an audience, we're torn between the two sides, who was right, who was wrong, and we can have debates in the comments section about it. There's fantastic large-scale action set pieces with all of our heroes fighting each other at an airport, but then there's also very personal stakes when you move into the end of the film. Individual films, I think they're great, but what holds this one back from that top spot for me is that it doesn't feel like a cohesive trilogy, where the trilogy itself is taking our character on a journey from beginning to end, where you get to the end of Civil War and Captain America surrenders the shield, but that's not the end of Steve Rogers' journey. No one thought that was the end of Steve Rogers' journey. And even that gesture was a statement more about the Avengers. The end of that movie is the Avengers breaking up, not Steve Rogers retiring from MCU films. In which case, that film, as many people have said since it came out, is kind of like Avengers 2.5. I think Steve Rogers very clearly is the star, the central character of it, but it also very much does function as an Avengers 2.5. It is very much about the Avengers conflict breaking up. And so when you're doing as just a trilogy, if I'm evaluating it as a unit, you have one movie that's a World War II war film, origin story, and then you have a political thriller, and then you have Avengers 2.5 with Steve Rogers as the lead. And none of them, like, there's an arc for Steve. There's his journey of disillusionment with the establishment. There is a journey and an arc there that runs throughout all of them that leads to Steve's choice that he makes in Civil War with his position. It is based off what happened in the previous two films. And at the same time, they feel very much like different films that just happen to have the lead character in this franchise. They all feel like MCU films. They all feel like Steve Rogers-led MCU films, but not a cohesive trilogy telling a single story from beginning to end about this character, where we start one place, we take him to the end, and it's fulfilling. No, it's not quite like that. It's just 3 great movies starring Steve Rogers. But in first place, Guardians of the Galaxy. And when it comes to this franchise, like the Spider-Man franchise, 2 of these movies are in my top 10 in particular. Both of them in my top 10 are ahead of both of the Spider-Man movies that are in my top 10. And then the second movie in the franchise is much lower. Historically, I've had it way down at the bottom. I have dramatically softened on my criticisms of Volume 2 since the holiday special, since rewatching the movie post Phase 4, and even in light of watching Volume 3 a couple of times. It's made me appreciate the movie more and not be as bothered by some of my issues with it, but I still think by far it's the weakest of the Guardians of the Galaxy films. When it comes to just, once again, average quality of the franchise, the individual films, Captain America would be number 1. But I think without question that the Guardians of the Galaxy have the most cohesive trilogy of films. And what I mean by that is that it's very obvious what James Gunn wanted to do with these characters. What brought them together, their brokenness that brought them together, why they needed each other for a phase of life. And by the time you get to the end of Volume 3, you also understand why they need to move on from one another as they've grown and changed, and there's something next for each of them. And that doesn't mean the Band-Aid of the Guardians of the Galaxy anymore. It means them actually doing what's next, what's right for them personally as individuals, as each of them have grown and changed. Each of them have been explored. And there's all sorts of classic examples of this, but like with Rocket, he's introduced as, just this crazy talking raccoon with a bunch of guns. But even in Guardians Volume 1, when they do kind of the shot of them in the lineup, they mention Lila in there. They mention him escaping prisons in there. Later in the film, he has a meltdown where he's talking about how he didn't ask to be ripped apart and put back together. His origin story is always in there.
Well, I didn't ask to get made. I didn't ask to be torn apart and put back together over and over and turned into some little monster.
The whole trilogy starts with Star-Lord running away from his grandfather because of the very personal pain. And it ends with him returning home, closing that out and having that resolution. Something like with Drax, we're introduced to him in kind of an extreme phase of life where he's out for revenge over what happened to his family. And enough time passes that he forms a new family and he's no longer out for revenge. He's already gotten it. And so then he's kind of trying to look for a purpose. And through Volume 3, they kind of reveal, like, he's never meant to be this guy out for revenge. He's meant to be like a family man. If you just listen to his little dialogue in each of these films, he always pauses to talk about his daughter, his wife, and have these very fatherly little moments. And that's where we end with him. So you just have very much these arcs for the characters. And a bunch of us were expecting many of our Guardians to die because we had this vision in our minds of who these characters were. And even as you go through Volume 3, you realize James Gunn has been setting things up that we'd missed. But when you look back, it's really obvious. And so the fact that all of my guesses about who was going to die were wildly wrong, that's an example of James Gunn being a better writer, had a better understanding of the characters that me as the audience and most of you as the audience, and can deliver something totally different from what I expected that's so much more satisfying. That is what kind of elevates this trilogy to the top of the list because it feels complete. Feels like there was an exact journey James Gunn wanted to take these characters on. I mean, he's even said throughout interviews that the script for Volume 3 was completed 5 years ago before he was fired, and very little changed between when he was fired and when he was rehired. He said he's always had this idea in mind for Rocket's backstory. They had the idea for the plot while he was writing Volume 2. One guy's vision, and so it feels proper, complete, and satisfying as a unit, as a trilogy. So for me, that's why it comes in at number 1. Also, just love these characters and love that they were done right from beginning and then by the end. So it's all of that. If you enjoyed this video, I've got a ton more MCU content. I've ranked the movies, the heroes, the villains, the final battles, so much more. You can check those out right over there in that playlist with my top MCU rankings. Right down there, you can check out my reviews of each of the MCU films, and then there's a cool video I did right down there where I ranked all 58 Marvel movies from all the different franchises. One of the biggest projects I've ever done, and a absolute blast. Check it out down there. Thank you so much for watching. Keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.